1. Introduction. RAWSEP view. The United States government was on track in the Biden administration to reduce the prices for both clean energy heat pumps and clean energy electric cars. Trump tariffs are expected to upset those plans to prevent future air pollution and prevent climate change. The United States government should, instead of certifying wood stoves as safe when they are not safe, go forward with regulations that ban wood stove use and direct government money for use of forest refuse only. For home building and furniture building. For just a few examples of use of forest products for non-burning uses, it is well known from scientific and medical research that wood burning is a substantial source of PM 2.5 emissions, yet the wood burning industry uses the scientifically debunked theory named carbon neutrality of wood burning to argue that wood burning replacing coal burning in industry, and in a trickle-down argument that wood burning should continue for home heating should continue. Presumably because it is called renewable. Wood may be renewable in the sense that a tree can be planted in the place of a cut-down burned tree, but it takes centuries or decades for the newly planted tree to attain the stature of the cut-down burned tree. During those centuries or decades, photosynthesis, which converts CO2 to oxygen and so sequesters some carbon, will not take place at the same rate as photosynthesis was performed previously, and wood burning emits both CO2 and PM 2.5, and PM 2.5 is not absorbed by trees, so PM 2.5 is not diminished by planting a tree in the place of a cut-down and burned tree. In fact, a living tree closes its pores against the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning, just as humans hold their breath in the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning. And when a tree closes its pores, the level of photosynthesis that absorbs CO2 pollution goes down. Wood burning emits 90% PM 2.5 particulate matter of 2.5 micrometer size, the perfect size to infiltrate the human lungs, setting off a cascade of human health problems and early deaths. Contrary to many beliefs, wood burning emits 2.8 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel coal burning, and wood burning emits 450 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel natural gas burning. Replacing coal burning with wood burning creates more air pollution in the form of CO2 and PM 2.5 than coal burning. This emission data comes from testing the cleanest burning wood stove in the United Kingdom, the Eco-Design Wood Stove, and International Convention does not count the emissions from wood burning. The emissions from wood burning are erased from all countries around the world when calculating if each country has met its climate goals. This non-counting or erasure of wood burning emissions data from climate goals does not mean wood burning emissions do not exist. RAWSEP view. Purple air. PM 2.5 monitors hanging from the eaves of the house of a near neighbor should be used to measure the level of PM 2.5 in the air hyperlocally in the yards of near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners. If PM 2.5 levels exceed World Health Organization standards of 5 micrograms per cubic meter annually, then that evidence of air pollution from wood burning should lead to the shutdown of that indoor residential wood burning appliance, one appliance at a time if necessary.
Hi, my name is Lily. Andrew gave you the intro to Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates and their concern for air pollution from indoor residential wood burning. Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates, or RAWSEP, would like every near neighbor of an indoor residential wood burner whose wood smoke enters their yards and sickens the near neighbors to have a purple air PM 2.5 monitor hanging from the eaves of their home to measure the level of PM 2.5 entering their yards. That measurement of air pollution should be used as evidence of unnecessary air pollution, and each indoor residential wood burner should be shut down based on that evidence, one indoor residential wood burner at a time if necessary. The presentation by Andrew ended at 2 minutes 5 seconds. The same presentation by Emma starts at 2 minutes 3 seconds before the end of this podcast. So I am Lily, your timekeeper, and you can start the next podcast at 2 minutes 5 seconds in if you would not like to see the presentation by Andrew a second time. This presentation by me, Lily, ends at 5 minutes in. What you will see in the main content of this RAWSEP podcast will be news about air pollution from indoor residential wood burning and how that air pollution is being combated by ordinary people just like you who are unfortunately near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners at this time. There will also be news about unnecessary and highly polluting use of wood as fuel in industrial wood burners and preventable air pollution from wood burning wildfires. There will also be news about air pollution from PM 2.5 from gas-powered cars. There will also be news about airborne diseases which are also preventable with vaccines such as COVID-19 and measles and whooping cough, to name just a few. In 2025, Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates is also concerned with combating the Trump destruction of government funding for programs which protect human health through the Department of Health and Human Services, and Trump destruction of programs which fund the science and medical research plan to protect human health from preventable illnesses. Protecting human health is a patriotic act, and our defense against enemies is weakened if we are not as healthy as we can be. Heat pump rebates are now offered by the federal government, distributed through the eligible United States, are available in 2025, and are the best, cleanest, and now cheapest alternative to indoor residential wood burning if that burning is actually done to purportedly save money. Wind and solar as sources of the electricity that powers heat pumps and electric cars is also cheaper than burning wood. The adverse health effects that are caused by indoor residential wood burning also come at a cost to near neighbors, both in shortening and ending their lives, and in actual hospital, clinic, and funeral costs. Instead of being compensated monetarily, near neighbors should instead be able to achieve immediate relief by stopping indoor residential wood burning in their hyper-localized neighborhoods, which relief readings from purple air PM 2.5 monitors used as evidence of air pollution will help them achieve. Welcome to news about hopeful scientific and medical achievements that will also help us achieve the goal of clean air to breathe.
Webisode 57DHXZO November 20th, 2025. I look at a stranger and see a friend. Am I a super recognizer? Super recognizer is a term coined in 2009 by Harvard and University College London researchers for people with significantly better than average face recognition ability. Super recognizers are able to memorize and recall thousands of faces, often having seen them only once. In Webisode 57DHXZO 1 and 2 United States 3 and 4 Washington, D.C. 5 and 6 California 7 Georgia 8 New Jersey 9 Pennsylvania 10 Wisconsin 11 and 12 Brazil 13 and 14 Europe 15 Denmark 16 Switzerland 17 Poland. Main content. 1 United States Medicine and Science Healthcare. Welcome to the Trump America, a place where people cannot afford to call an ambulance. Arwa Mahdawi Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization, The Guardian, November 19th, 2025. My wife spends $750 a month on health insurance for our 3-person family, with the rest covered by her employer, and we still have to pay a minimum of $500 to visit the emergency room, according to a 2024 YouGov poll. Nearly a quarter of Americans did not call an ambulance during a medical emergency because they were worried about costs. Now the roughly 154 million people who get health insurance through their employer are going to see their paycheck deductions rise by 6 to 7% on average next year. One analysis has found, meanwhile, people who get insurance through the Affordable Care Act marketplace, often known as Obamacare, are going to see the cost of their cover go up by 26% on average next year because subsidies are set to expire, and Republicans refuse to come up with a plan to address this. Back in 2018, before I got insurance through my spouse, I was paying $470 a month as a freelancer for my Obamacare plan. Now, that same plan would cost over $900 a month, with $4,000 excess, and wages have only gone up a little bit. 2 United States. The key to fighting lung cancer is more screenings. New study shows. The New York Times. If everyone eligible had a lung cancer screening, 62,000 lives would be saved over 5 years. And new study shows. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization, The New York Times, November 19th, 2025. Tens of thousands of lives could be saved if more people got screened for lung cancer, according to a new study. Each year, lung cancer kills nearly 125,000 people in the United States, more than breast, colorectal, and cervical cancers combined. The paper published on Wednesday in the Journal of the American Medical Association found that lung cancer screenings could prevent 62,000 deaths over a 5-year period, or 4 times as many as are being saved today. The screening itself is a straightforward CT scan that captures far more detail than an X-ray, said a scientific director at the American Cancer Society who led the research. Getting this yearly scan can help catch lung cancer in its early stages, when the 5-year survival rate is 60%, but almost half of lung cancers are caught in their late stages, when patients have less than a 10% chance of surviving. 3 Washington, D.C. RFK Jr. Lack of knowledge of medicine and science. RFK Jr. is in a power struggle. The health secretary and his Food and Drug Administration FDA chief Marty Makary cannot agree on how to proceed with vaccine safety studies. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. Politico, November 19th, 2025. A top aide to health secretary RFK Jr. is locked in a power struggle with his boss in the White House over vaccine policy and personnel. For now, the head of the Food and Drug Administration, Marty Makary, still has his job, but the dispute, which centers on how the agency will examine vaccine side effects, is unresolved. RFK Jr. is reluctant to be more forceful with his demands because it would contribute to a perception of chaos within his department. RFK Jr. already ousted 2 deputies in his office, in the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention this year, an activist against vaccines before Trump named him health secretary. RFK Jr. has asked the FDA, which approves drugs and monitors them once they are on the market, to quickly stand up additional vaccine safety studies. Makary has not yet moved on the request, believing that the agency first needs to develop a new system for examining vaccine side effects. That irritates RFK Jr., a former Johns Hopkins surgeon. Makary was, like RFK Jr., a prominent critic of COVID lockdowns. Makary has been unable to promote policy advisor Sanjala Jane Nagpal to deputy chief of staff because the White House has not signed off. Jane Nagpal nonetheless announced her appointment on a call with FDA stakeholders on November 12th. Top drug regulator George Tidmarsh, a Makary aide, was dismissed by Makary in early November, and White House officials weighed scaling back the Makary role by installing a day-to-day operations lead while keeping him as commissioner. The idea was dropped after White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles intervened. Makary subsequently promoted longtime oncology chief Richard Pazder to replace Tidmarsh, who resigned amid concerns about his personal conduct. Tidmarsh said he was quitting because of changes to the drug review process. He objected to Makary, buoyed by the Susie Wiles backing has increasingly routed sensitive questions to the White House rather than HHS, as in August. Wiles intervened to reverse a White House decision to fire FDA vaccine chief Vinay Prasad, who is close to Makary. RFK Jr. and Makary both argued Prasad was essential, but the Prasad tendency to set a high bar for drug approvals has run afoul of conservatives who favor the right to try ethos that Trump endorsed when he signed legislation during his first administration. HHS leadership is now closely monitoring every move inside the FDA, the officials said, including schedules and planned news statements, and has delayed announcements when necessary. Makary rarely uses email, complicating coordination as tensions rise. A coup to CDC. The CDC is now 2 distinct agencies, a house divided against itself. There are the career officers who continue to carry out the core mission of the agency, that is the CDC, of legends like Dr. William Foge, the former director, who played a major role in eradicating smallpox. These dedicated federal employees may be hindered by cuts and are still roiling from the August attack on their headquarters, but they are doing what they can to keep us safe. Then there is a small coterie, a top brass gang of RFK Jr. allies who control major policies, public relations, and social media. In Senate testimony, former Chief Medical Officer Dr. Deborah Oury, one of the top CDC officials who resigned last month, described the situation as a hostile takeover. How is this manifesting? Most glaringly, the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices (ACIP) met last month voting on national policy, without actually engaging in a review of the best evidence on the topics. Instead, the information presented was cherry-picked out of context and amateurish. At times, the CDC also posted a truly bizarre new priorities statement, basically a political manifesto that included a typically Trump world anti-DI rand among other random tangents, including one which came out against harm reduction for substance use disorders, the evidence-based approach that has saved lives. Meanwhile, the social media accounts of the CDC posted sentiments against vaccines after its ACIP meeting. I am still receiving some normal CDC communications in my inbox, including important announcements about drug-resistant bacteria. So now when we hear from the CDC, we have to ask which CDC is speaking. Last month, I interviewed Dr. Oury for MedPage Today. It is out as a 3-part series. Part 1, Super Tough Decision. Top CDC official reflects on her resignation. Former Chief Medical Officer Deborah Oury discusses leadership science and the attack on the CDC. Part 2, US may not be ready for the next outbreak. Ex-CDC official says we were in a much better place up until about 7 or 8 months ago. Says Deborah Oury. Part 3, my phone started blowing up. How CDC leaders learned of new limits on COVID shots. We were not comfortable implementing new guidance off a social media video, says Deborah Oury. In the time since, we have seen more notable departures, including Dr. Melina Wharton, who spent nearly 4 decades at the CDC after training at Harvard MD and Johns Hopkins MPH. In epidemiology, these are the experts we are losing. That is why HHS employees have demanded that Secretary RFK Jr. resign. They are not alone. Dozens of expert medical societies have made similar statements. Until RFK Jr. is gone or reigned in, the foundation of the CDC is at risk of falling apart. Hopefully Congress will eventually pass something closer to the most recent proposal of the Senate, which would only cut $100 million in funding to the CDC, bringing funding down from $9.2 billion to $9.1 billion. But if the House gets its way, $1.8 billion would vanish, bringing funding down to $7.4 billion. But even that would be better than the Trump proposal, which would cut CDC funding by $5 billion down to $4.2 billion. In early September, HHS Secretary RFK Jr. sought to rush 7 new members onto ACIP in time for its most recent meeting. By the time the meeting occurred, 5 of those 7 had been officially installed. The other 2 RFK Jr. hopefuls are either out for reasons unknown or will be installed by the next meeting, currently scheduled for later this fall. Meanwhile, the Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee of the FDA has lost Dr. Paul Offit, who was fired last month. Ironically, Dr. Offit was the most independent voices on the committee, including having voted against some of the COVID-19 boosters on the grounds that they were not sufficiently improved from the earlier versions, a principled, data-driven stance it turns out. For Washington, D.C., Trump signs off on Epstein files, release excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against would smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. Substack letters from an American. Heather Cox Richardson, November 20th, 2025. Yesterday, the House of Representatives passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act. This measure gives the Department of Justice 30 days to release the files the Federal Bureau of Investigation collected when investigating the late sex abuser Jeffrey Epstein. The vote was 427-1, with Representative Clay Higgins, Republican of Louisiana, casting the only nay vote. After the vote, Epstein survivors in the galleries cheered. The strong vote in favor came after Trump, who had tried to kill the release of the Epstein files for months, on Sunday night suddenly reversed course after failing to stop dozens of House Republicans from giving their support to the measure. He said he did not care if it passed, starting a stampede of Republicans eager to be on the popular side of the issue. House Speaker Mike Johnson, RLA, evidently went along with this strategy because he expected Senate Majority Leader John Thune, RSD, to stall the measure with amendments if it finally passed. Nonetheless, the House would have to take it up again and could delay it further. After the House passed the bill, Johnson told reporters he would insist upon amendments. But Thune was not inclined to play along. Johnson has been openly doing the Trump bidding and jamming the Senate to force it to comply, and Thune appears to have had enough. Before the measure went to the Senate, Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, asked for unanimous consent to pass the measure. When it arrived, the Senate agreed, and thus the bill passed the Senate automatically by a unanimous vote in favor. Mike Johnson did not take the news of the Senate passage particularly while saying, "I am deeply disappointed in this outcome. It needed amendments. I just spoke to the president about that. We will see what happens." Johnson said both he and the president have concerns about the bill. Trump seemed to sense last night that the jig was up. "I do not care when the Senate passes the House bill," he wrote in the early evening, "whether tonight or at some other time in the near future. I just do not want Republicans to take their eyes off all the victories that we have had." He went on to record his usual list of exaggerations and fantasy successes, but the message seemed as if he was acknowledging defeat. Those combing through the files from the Epstein estate released by the House Oversight Committee last week are turning up more disturbing information just a week before his arrest. In 2019, Epstein wrote to Trump ally Steve Bannon, "Now you can understand why Trump wakes up in the middle of the night sweating when he hears you and I are friends." The Trump attempts to distance himself from the horrors around Epstein will not be made easier by news reported yesterday that the Trump White House intervened to make Customs and Border Protection return the electronic devices they seized from accused sex trafficker Andrew Tate and his brother Tristan when they arrived in Florida earlier this year. The two have been accused of sex trafficking in Romania and the UK today. Attorney General Pam Bondi said the Department of Justice would release the files within 30 days as the law requires, but suggested the administration might try to bottle up the files because at the Trump demand, she opened an investigation into the Democrats named in them. She told reporters that she could not comment on that investigation because it is a pending investigation. A Reuters Ipsos poll released yesterday showed the Trump job approval rating has fallen another 2 percentage points since a similar poll in early November. A Marist poll released today shows that registered voters prefer Democrats to Republicans on a generic ballot for the 2026 midterms by an astonishing 14%. In November 2024, the preference of voters was divided evenly 48% to 48%. The Trump hope of rigging the 2026 midterm elections took another hit yesterday when a panel of 3 federal judges said Texas could not use the new middle-of-the-decade district map Trump demanded to shift 5 Democratic-dominated districts to Republican domination in the 2019 Richo versus Common Cause decision. The Supreme Court said that federal courts cannot review partisan gerrymandering, and so the Texas Republicans who redrew the districts insisted their gerrymandering was strictly about partisanship, but two judges disagreed. Texas immediately appealed to the Supreme Court. 5 California U.S. Representative Ro Khanna, opinion, the Democrat who split MAGA over the Epstein files excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against would smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization, the New York Times, November 19, 2025. Washington, D.C., with a near unanimous vote in Congress to pass his bill requiring the release of Jeffrey Epstein files. Representative Ro Khanna, Democrat of California, can claim a victory that no other Democratic presidential prospect has achieved. Cracking the MAGA coalition. Early polls suggest he would be a heavy underdog if he runs, but the California Democrat has been traveling to swing states in early contests to test the water for a possible White House bid. Khanna, 49, teamed up with Representative Thomas Massie, Republican of Kentucky, to introduce the Epstein Files Transparency Act. In July, the bill requires the Justice Department to release its records related to Epstein, the late financier and convicted sex offender who had connections to a number of powerful figures, within 30 days. 6 California housing. California has a legal clause for housing that could put not in my backyard NIMBYs in a corner. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against would smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization, the New York Times, November 19, 2025. The law is called the remedy of the builder, and it was designed to break the political log jams that have made California one of the most difficult places in the country to build. The law works by nullifying local zoning rules when cities fail to plan for enough housing as required by the state. While the remedy for builder remedy has been on the books since 1990, it was effectively dormant until 2022. Since then, however, developers across the state have filed dozens of plans to build 10 and 20-story buildings in neighborhoods where they had never been allowed. A builder who helped pioneer the tactic has proposed 10 such projects across Los Angeles County. The chief executive of California Yes in My Backyard YMBY, a group that pushes for more housing, referred to the remedy for builders as the NIMBY sword of Damocles. Just the threat of it has prompted cities to accept more housing than they had in decades. 7 Georgia RFK Jr. lack of knowledge of medicine and science. CDC fills its autism webpage with talking points against vaccination. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against would smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. Inside Medicine newsletter, November 20th, 2025. Yesterday, the CDC updated its webpage on autism and vaccines. The update represents an extraordinary moment in the history of the public health system of our nation, a crossing the Rubicon moment. The CDC page on vaccines and autism is now filled with the talking points of people against vaccines. It is both expected. We certainly saw this coming ever since the vote of Bill Cassidy in favor of RFK Jr. as Secretary of Health and Human Services clinched his confirmation bid, but it is still shocking to see that said the first thing you would notice if you open the page might be the innocuous header text that precedes the main body of the page that reads vaccines do not cause autism. So far so good. The problem is the asterisk and everything else on the page. The asterisk is explained at the bottom of the page. It reads the header vaccines do not cause autism has not been removed due to an agreement with the chair of the U.S. Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee that it would remain on the CDC website. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, November 19, 2025. In other words, Senator and Health Committee Chair Bill Cassidy extracted a promise from RFK Jr. during his confirmation process that apparently included a stipulation regarding the precise language of the header text for this webpage. So the CDC under Secretary RFK Jr. is seemingly abiding by some aspects of the Senator Cassidy requirement, which was levied in exchange for a vote in favor of the RFK Jr. confirmation, but certainly not the spirit of the agreement. Cassidy mistakenly believed that the RFK Jr. empty promises would be sufficient to protect our national vaccine policies from his attacks. How quaint. It turns out to have been one of the great blunders in the history of the public health of our nation. Virtually everything else on the page is indeed the dream scenario of someone against vaccination. The CDC is now spouting misinformation. The key point summary that appears at the top of the page is an astonishing departure from the long-standing evidence-based stances of the agency that refuted any connection between vaccines and autism. Here is how the top of the CDC page on autism and vaccines now reads. Key points. The claim vaccines do not cause autism is not an evidence-based claim, because studies have not ruled out the possibility that infant vaccines cause autism. Studies supporting a link have been ignored by health authorities. HHS has launched a comprehensive assessment of the causes of autism, including investigations on plausible biologic mechanisms and potential causal links. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, November 19, 2025. In other words, the CDC has become a PR apparatus for Secretary RFK Jr. and his allies against vaccination rather than a reflection of the best available science. Remember, RFK Jr. admitted that he had hired scientists who would make the proof needed to support his kooky views on vaccines. These statements and the summary of pseudoscience and, in some cases, misunderstood actual science that follows them are an overt attempt to sow doubt among parents. This will lead to vaccine hesitancy and eventually to the emergence again of vaccine-preventable diseases that cause suffering and death. The fallout begins. Dr. Demetra Daskalakis, the former director of the CDC National Center for Immunizations and Respiratory Diseases, said the CDC cannot be trusted as a source. It is a weapon. Dr. Daskalakis means that the agency is now an extension of the Secretary RFK Jr. movement against vaccine. Scientists at the CDC were completely blindsided by this update, but changes like this had long been feared, and it was assumed that a pivot to misinformation regarding a link between vaccines and autism was only a matter of time. This distortion of science under the CDC moniker is the reason I resigned with my colleagues, Daskalakis said, referring to the simultaneous resignations of Dr. Deborah Oury, Dr. Daniel Jernigan, and himself, commonly known as the 3D, which occurred in the wake of the firing of CDC Director Dr. Susan Minares in late August after she valiantly refused to reflexively rubber stamp the RFK Jr. directives against vaccines. How bad are things at the CDC? When I asked an active CDC employee what he thought about the latest bad news, he literally had to ask, which thing are you referring to? When I pointed him to the newly released autism and vaccines page, he expressed surprise and disappointment, describing the newly updated page as grossly misleading. Experts around the world have already begun to take notice on threads. A prominent immunologist in Portugal said the CDC pages have now been hijacked for state-sponsored disinformation. It is terrible to see this happening. This is ideology unscientific. Over facts, data, and the scientific method, I have not yet spoken to any active CDC employees within the immunization divisions, but Dr. Daskalakis does not think the agency can survive. On one hand, I wonder how many career scientists at the agency will tolerate being associated with misinformation like this. On the other, public health jobs are increasingly scarce, especially since the CDC cut billions of dollars in funding to state and local departments earlier this year, cuts which have led to layoffs. While many principled CDC scientists might like to resign in protest, some may feel they have no choice but to remain and attempt to hold the line for science from within, and some staff of the CDC have been successful in such efforts this year. So while the Trump-led takeover of the CDC is now well underway, many within the agency may respond not by leaving, but either by continuing to resist from within, or if that fails, simply quiet quitting. 8 New Jersey medicine and science tick-borne diseases allergy to red meat after a mysterious death. The quest of a family for answers leads to a tick. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization, the New York Times. RAWSEP view AI overview. Man died from tick-borne virus. Now his family is warning others. The quest of a family for answers after the mysterious death of a JetBlue pilot led to the discovery that he had died from alpha-gal syndrome, a severe and potentially fatal allergy to red meat triggered by a tick bite. The man, who had previously experienced illness after eating red meat, died from anaphylaxis hours after a barbecue, and a post-mortem analysis revealed the tick-borne allergy as the cause of death, which had initially been ruled a sudden and unexplained death. Delayed reaction. The allergic reaction typically occurs hours after consuming red meat, leading many people to mistake it for food poisoning. Previous symptoms. The family of the man recalled that he had experienced similar, though less severe, symptoms after eating red meat on a previous camping trip, though they had not linked it to the tick bites they believed he had sustained around the same time. Why this case is significant. First confirmed death. This case is believed to be the first documented death from alpha-gal syndrome. Estimates. The CDC estimates that up to 450,000 Americans may have alpha-gal allergy, but many are unaware of the risk. The CDC cannot be trusted as a source. It is a weapon. Quote from former director of the CDC National Center for Immunizations and Respiratory Diseases, Dr. Demetra Daskalakis. 9 Pennsylvania. Trump officials announce $1 billion loan to restart 3 Mile Island nuclear plant. Pennsylvania. The Guardian. Trump officials announce $1 billion loan to restart 3 Mile Island nuclear plant. The facility that was site of worst nuclear disaster in U.S. history will provide power for Microsoft data centers. The Guardian. November 19, 2025. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization, the Trump administration has announced a $1 billion federal loan to restart the nuclear power plant at the Pennsylvania 3 Mile Island that is under contract to provide power to the Microsoft data centers. Constellation signed a 20-year purchase agreement in 2024 with Microsoft, which needs power for its artificial intelligence operations to restart the 835 megawatts reactor that shut in 2019. The other unit at the plant, renamed the Crane Clean Energy Center, shut in 1979 after the most serious nuclear meltdown and radiation leak in U.S. history. U.S. power demand is rising for the first time in 2 decades, driven by technologies, including artificial intelligence. Critics have pointed out that the U.S. has failed to find permanent storage for radioactive waste emissions. Billow from a nuclear power generating station at night. 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor to restart to power Microsoft AI operations. The company has hired hundreds of workers, completed infrastructure inspections, and ordered major equipment for the project, which is expected to come online in 2027. It will need to revamp cooling towers, install a main power transformer, among other equipment, and refuel before producing electricity. The plant also needs U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and water-related permitting. Constellation said this year Constellation was guaranteeing the loan and that the loan structure would protect taxpayers if the project does not succeed. 10 Wisconsin. RAWSEP view how one research university celebrates National Rural Health Day from the newsletter. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. Today marks National Rural Health Day with the theme of celebrating the power of rural. Since 2011, the third Thursday in November has been designated to showcasing the efforts of rural healthcare providers. State offices of rural health explore the National Rural Health Day key messages and data points resource showing the realities of rural life through both stories and data. A webinar is offered by Wisconsin Emergency Medical Services EMS Association, focused on the vital role of rural EMS providers and systems sustaining emergency care across Wisconsin and highlighting first responder well-being rooted in community. Reimagining rural health. 11 Brazil amid squabbles, bombast, and competing interests. What can COP30 achieve? COP30. The Guardian. RAWSEP view AI overview. COP30 held in Belém, Brazil, aims to address the urgent need to halt global heating and implement effective climate solutions amidst competing interests and divisions. Key objectives include preservation of forests. The Brazil demand for the Tropical Forests Forever facility seeks to protect existing forests and prevent further deforestation. Implementation focus. The summit emphasizes practical, measurable, and scalable solutions, prioritizing technologies that are market-ready and scalable. Addressing fossil fuels. Discussions on transitioning away from fossil fuels are crucial, reflecting the need for consensus and accountability in climate action. Stakeholder engagement. COP30 2030 aims to engage stakeholders in climate policy, sustainable technology, and finance, with a focus on delivering bold and accountable actions. The summit is seen as a transitional milestone where discussions evolve into action aiming for measurable outcomes and justice in climate action. From the article excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization, world leaders who jetted in over the Amazon rainforest, its green vastness scarred and pockmarked by widespread logging ranches and small individual farm clearings, are in no doubt as to the Brazil key demand from them to sign up to the Tropical Forest Forever Facility TFFF for the presidency. This will be the single most important achievement of COP30, a fund that will be used to keep existing forests standing. Brazil wants to gather pledges of $25 billion for the TFFF, initially using this to attract a further $100 billion from the global financial markets. The money would be dispensed to forested regions, rewarding them for reducing deforestation and providing finance for biodiversity conservation work. But the subject the hosts seem much less comfortable with is the root cause of the climate crisis: fossil fuels. At COP28 in Dubai in 2023, a historic resolution was made that the world must transition away from fossil fuels. It may seem astonishing that this was the first time in 30 years of talks the subject had been addressed directly. The intransigence of petrostates and the need for consensus within the UN process had prevented such a move before. As soon as it was over, fellow petrostates, chiefly Saudi Arabia, began to try to unpick the agreement. At COP29 in Azerbaijan, another economy heavily dependent on exporting oil and gas, attempts to reaffirm the resolution were stymied. Supporters want to pick up the fight again this year. Though about 50 countries are thought to want to prevent it being discussed, Brazil ranks in the top 10 global oil and gas exporters and is prospecting for new fields, some of them offshore from the Amazon. The president of Brazil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, has strongly defended the rights of poor countries to carry on exploiting their resources, arguing it is the rich countries that have benefited from them for 2 centuries and caused the climate crisis who must stop. 12 Brazil divide over fossil fuels phase out can be bridged. COP30 president says COP30. The Guardian: Brazil failed to land an early COP30 climate deal on Wednesday, November 20th, 2025, though President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva remained upbeat about the prospects of progress in the last 2 days of the summit despite differences between nations on key issues. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, November 20th, 2025. The Brazilian host of the 2-week UN summit in the Amazonian city of Belém had hoped to secure approval for a deal covering some of the most divisive issues in the global climate talks, including fossil fuels and climate finance. Lula spent the day meeting delegations from key negotiating blocs to hash out a deal. I am so happy that I leave here certain that my negotiators will have the best result a COP could have ever offered to the planet Earth, he told reporters after the meetings, referring to the acronym for the climate meetings known formally as the Conference of the Parties. COP Brazil had hoped to buck the trend in which recent climate summits ran well past deadline, but a promised revised deal text did not materialize on Wednesday and was now not expected until Thursday. Rifts remain over issues. A central issue in the COP30 talks is whether countries will agree to develop a roadmap setting out how the world will transition away from fossil fuels. Burning coal, oil, and natural gas is the main source of the emissions heating the planet. The COP28 climate summit in 2023 agreed to this transition, but nations have not mapped out how or when it will happen. Dozens of countries, including Germany, Kenya, and Britain, have rallied behind a deal for a roadmap away from fossil fuels, but as of Wednesday, less than half of countries at the summit had publicly backed this idea. To bring more countries on board with the idea, the European Union submitted a proposal late on Wednesday. The proposal said countries would offer a roadmap to manage the shift from fossil fuels guided by the best available science on climate change, but in a non-prescriptive way, meaning it would not impose specific obligations on individual countries. Saudi Arabia was one of those opposed to plans to transition away from fossil fuels. Other contentious issues in the package include pinning down how rich countries will provide financing to poorer countries to switch to clean energy, and what must be done about a gap between promised emissions cuts and those needed to stop temperatures rising. One diplomatic standoff that had been hanging over the conference was nearly resolved on Wednesday. Turkey and Australia drew close to striking a deal under which Turkey will host the COP31 event in 2026, while Australia will lead the negotiations of the conference among governments. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said 13 Europe plan to speed tanks and armies across Europe in case of war with Russia. European Union. The Guardian: the European Commission seeks to ease rules on cross-border movements to create military Schengen zone. RAWSEP View AI Overview. Schengen refers to the Schengen area, a zone of 29 European countries that have abolished passport and other border controls at their mutual borders for free movement of people and goods. The name comes from the 1985 agreement signed in the town of Schengen, Luxembourg. The agreement allows citizens of member countries to travel freely, but non-EU citizens are still subject to entry requirements when entering the area from a non-Schengen country. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The Guardian, November 19th, 2025. The EU executive has pledged to ease red tape to speed up the movement of European armies and tanks across the continent, describing it as a critical insurance policy for European security. A military mobility plan announced by the European Commission on Wednesday is part of an effort to ensure Europe is ready to defend itself by 2030, in line with warnings from security services that Russia could be able to attack an EU member state within 5 years if an army sought today to move from a Western European port to the EU eastern border with Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. It would encounter significant obstacles and delays, say EU officials. They point to bridges that cannot bear the weight of tanks, railway tunnels that are too small, and track gauges too narrow to accommodate military vehicles, as well as EU paperwork on working time and customs. At least one EU member state requires 45 days notice for cross-border troop movements, in contrast to the objective of a 3-day border procedure pledged by EU countries in 2024, according to the EU auditors. Another Unnamed member state once denied entry to a convoy of tanks because they violated weight limits and local road traffic laws. If a bridge cannot carry a 60-ton tank, we have a problem. If a runway is too short for a cargo plane, we cannot resupply our crews, said the EU foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas, who described the 45-day permission rule as not good enough 11 years after the Russia annexation of Crimea. She said the latest EU proposals would underpin rather than duplicate the NATO defense. Planning military mobility is a critical insurance policy for European security. You hope you never have to use it to the full capacity, but having it ready ensures more credible deterrence and defense. She said the Commission wants to create a military Schengen zone, meaning armies can move through the EU border free travel area as easily as civilians. It has proposed an emergency system for cross-border military transport that would give military convoys priority on the transport network. In an emergency situation, armies would get exemptions from usual EU rules, such as mandatory rest periods for drivers of heavy goods vehicles, as well as faster customs procedures for hardware and military supplies, including food arriving at the EU external border. EU officials have identified a priority list of 500 bridges, tunnels, bridges, roads, ports, and airports that need to be strengthened or adapted to handle heavy military traffic at a cost of about €100 billion or £88 billion. A tenfold increase in spending on military mobility of €17.6 billion has been earmarked in the proposed EU long-term budget for 2028 to 2034, although the overall $2 trillion plan faces opposition from many member states, hoping to scale back spending. 14 European Union EU plans hub to tackle disinformation threat from Russia and others. European Union, The Guardian. The move follows escalating hybrid attacks by Russia and other foreign powers spreading fake articles across social media. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against with smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The Guardian, November 8, 2025. The EU executive plans to create a center for democratic resilience to counter disinformation from Russia and other authoritarian regimes. According to a leaked paper, the European Commission intends for the center to bring together expertise across the EU and from countries seeking to join the bloc to fight foreign information manipulation and interference. The idea forms the centerpiece of the democracy shield pitched by the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen when she sought a second term before the 2024 European elections. Von der Leyen announced the idea of a European Center for Democratic Resilience in a speech to MEPs in September. The document, due to be released on November 12, sketches out further details, including where the Commission sees its biggest threat. In addition to its brutal war of aggression against Ukraine, Russia is also escalating hybrid attacks, waging a battle of influence against Europe states. The draft by spreading deceitful narratives, sometimes including the manipulation and falsification of historical facts. They try to erode trust in democratic systems. The EU Foreign Service says it has identified dozens of instances of Russian disinformation and information manipulation, such as the doppelganger campaign in the run-up to the European elections, where copycat versions of media sites that are well-known promulgated narratives against the West. Disinformation was carried on websites mimicking media outlets such as Die Welt, Le Point, La Stampa, and Polski Radio as part of the campaign, believed to have been active since 2022 on these copycat sites. Fake articles, which were also widely promoted on social media, sought to discredit politicians as well as undermine government support for Ukrainian refugees. Where Ukraine, the stakes of foreign interference were underscored when Romania became the first EU member state to annul an election after declassified intelligence revealed an alleged Russian campaign, including massive cyber attacks on the electoral IT system and social media meddling in favor of an ultranationalist candidate. Authorities in Moldova, an EU candidate country, have also alleged Russian interference in recent elections, including massive vote-buying schemes and propaganda campaigns. The center would be a hub for EU institutions and member states to share information and early warnings, as well as raising public awareness about foreign governments seeking to manipulate information. Participation in the center would be voluntary for EU states and countries hoping to join the EU. The Commission also suggests participation could be open to similarly minded partners, raising the prospect of involvement for the UK, which is often described in such terms. Other elements of the Democracy Shield plan include the creation of an independent network of fact-checkers to protect against misinformation, especially during elections, health emergencies, or natural disasters. Brussels also wants to see a voluntary network of internet influencers to raise awareness about EU rules on democratic and internet standards. 15. Denmark announces one of the most ambitious climate targets in the world while the rest of the EU looks away. World News. The Guardian. Governments across the continent have attacked green rules with increasing ferocity, all while professing their commitment to existing climate targets. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against with smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The Guardian, November 19, 2025. To little fanfare and few international headlines, Denmark just announced one of the most ambitious climate targets in the world. The unusually wind-powered and cycle-friendly Nordic nation, whose ruling Social Democrats suffered a setback in elections on Tuesday, promised on Monday to cut planet heating pollution by at least 82% by 2035 from 1990 levels. The goal inches past the UK landmark 81% target for that year and races ahead of the EU rather wide goal of 66.3% to 72.5%. Those numbers may seem strange to celebrate, given that most countries the UN classifies as developed have already promised to reach net zero emissions by the middle of the century, but climate scientists have long warned that the path to a clean economy matters as much as the exact end date. Delay too much action till the 2040s, as cash-strapped governments are wont to do, and even those who go fully green by 2050 will risk having already pumped out too much pollution. Despite these warnings, announcements such as that of Denmark are a rarity among the European ministers attending the COP30 climate summit in Brazil this month. The EU, meanwhile, is energetically simplifying rolling back ambitious climate policies under the banner of increasing the competitiveness of the bloc. The beating that the famous Green Deal of Europe is taking at home has begun to undermine its pleas for urgent climate action on the world stage. European countries are some of the biggest historical polluters of greenhouse gas, but have long championed stronger action at UN summits last week as negotiators converged on the Amazonian city of Bulim, situated on the edge of the beleaguered rainforest. The European Parliament voted to weaken a law to stop deforestation in supply chains and to restrict the scope of its green business rules, the blow to the Corporate Sustainability Directive, the first of several omnibus deregulation packages pushed by the Commission, attracted anger from green groups for removing an obligation on companies to create climate transition plans. These would force firms to explain how they are aligning business practices with the 1.5 centigrade global heating target, which countries agreed at a landmark climate summit in Paris 10 years ago, adding fuel to the fire. The center-right European Party of the People (EPP) voted with the far-right, whose centrists have traditionally shunned to win the vote. The surprise breakdown of the EU firewall comes 1 month after the fraying cordon sanitaire gave way in France, and in a year in which the Brandmauer of Germany has been chipped. RAWSEP View AI overview. The Brandmauer of Germany, often referred to as the firewall, has been facing significant challenges recently. Recent parliamentary motions, including a vote on anti-migration issues, have shown signs of weakening the firewall, allowing cooperation with the far-right alternative for Germany, AfD. This shift has led to increased public protests and discussions about the implications of such cooperation, particularly regarding immigration and asylum policies. The collapse of the Brandmauer is seen as a potential erosion of democratic integrity, with many political parties expressing concerns about the future of the political landscape of Germany. The ongoing debate highlights the complexities of balancing national security with democratic values, as the AfD rise in popularity poses a significant challenge to the established political framework of Germany. This situation reflects a broader trend of political fragmentation and the need for a more nuanced approach to managing far-right influences in Germany. 16 Switzerland, Geneva. Huge staff cuts at who will leave world less healthy and safe. Experts warn global development. The Guardian. The organization is to lose almost a quarter of its workforce in 2026, reducing its ability to help countries facing disease outbreaks. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates of 501. C3 nonprofit organization. The Guardian, November 19, 2025. The loss of more than 2,000 jobs at the World Health Organization (WHO) will leave the world less healthy and less safe. Experts have warned. The global health body said it expected to lose 2,371 posts, nearly a quarter of its workforce, by June 2026, as it deals with budget cuts after the U.S. withdrawal from the organization in January. At that point, the WHO had 9,401 staff members. Analysts and campaigners said the cuts made under financial pressure would probably leave the WHO less able to help countries facing disease outbreaks, whose staffing cuts are a regrettable but inevitable outcome of U.S. withdrawal and lower than hoped for contributions by other countries. The loss of expertise will leave the world less healthy and less safe, now more than ever. Who needs a clear strategic vision to navigate its new fiscal reality? Instead, these cuts are aimed at global and Africa-based staff at a time when who should be doubling down on its global work, such as coordinating responses to pandemics and other health threats, and providing limited country support to the poorest nations, most of which are in Africa. The highest number of cuts, 805 posts, will be in the WHO Geneva-based headquarters. Its African regional office will be the next worst affected, losing 638 of 2,541 posts, according to documents posted online. The U.S. decision, combined with funding cuts from other countries, left us facing a salary gap of about $500 million or £382 million. In a speech to member states, he said there was still a funding gap of $1 billion for 2026 and 2027, and asked for support to close its 17. Poland closes last Russian consulate after act of state terrorism on railway. Poland. The Guardian. Foreign minister orders closure of Gdansk consulate and says 4 people now arrested after sabotage attack. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates of 501c3 nonprofit organization. The Guardian, November 19, 2025. The Poland Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski has described the sabotage attack last weekend on the Poland rail system as an act of state terrorism ordered by Russia, as he announced that Poland was closing the last remaining Russian consulate in the country. The clear intention was to cause human casualties, he said of the weekend bomb attack. The Polish security services said they were in the process of arresting several people linked to the incident. They are on the trail of the principals. They are on the trail of the perpetrators. The first arrests are now taking place, the spokesperson Jacek Dobrzinski said on Wednesday morning. He said later that 4 people had been arrested on Tuesday. The Prime Minister Donald Tusk said authorities had identified 2 Ukrainian citizens involved in the attack who had arrived in Poland from Belarus and left soon after placing explosive devices on the rail tracks. Over the weekend, Tusk said Poland believed the men were cooperating with the Russia security services, and one had been arrested previously for sabotage in Ukraine. The pair are reportedly not among those who have been arrested. The blast damaged rail tracks near the town of Mika on a rail line linking Warsaw and eastern Poland, a key logistics route towards the border with Ukraine. There were no casualties, as the gap in the tracks was spotted by a regional train driver who alerted authorities. In a separate incident, power cables were destroyed along a nearby section of track. Sikorski said he was ordering the closure of the Gdansk consulate. Though it will not be our full response to the attack, he did not specify what other measures Poland might take. Poland has closed 2 other Russian consulates in Krakow and Poznan. In recent years, the embassy in Warsaw remains open. The defense minister, the Ladisław Kosiniak Commission, announced at the same press conference that the army was working on a plan, Operation Horizon, to deploy 10,000 soldiers to protect critical infrastructure across the country to counteract acts of diversion and raise the level of security for Polish citizens. Headlines: The New York Times, November 20th, 2025. Air pollution as the world still pursues clean power, millions still have no power at all. The New York Times artificial intelligence opinion is a bubble, maybe that is. Okay, the New York Times Comey Lindsay Halligan admits grand jury never saw final Comey indictment. The New York Times Comey opinion. The Comey case is a comedy of errors. The New York Times Consumers Fashion Street Style Look of the Week leopard pants. The New York Times Georgia U.S. House of Representatives called for release of Epstein files. Opinion. Marjorie Taylor Greene was not on our bingo card. The New York Times Hochul and Mamdani opinion. The New York governor can show Mamdani who has the mandate. The New York Times holiday season readers share their offbeat holiday traditions. The New York Times Howard Lutnick family affair. The sons of the Trump Commerce Secretary cash in on the artificial intelligence AI frenzy. The New York Times Mamdani. Trump and Mamdani will meet at White House on Friday. The New York Times Mamdani and Tish agreed to work together. Here is where they differ. The New York Times Republican who criticized January 6, 2021 insurrection Cheney service to underscore how politics has changed since he was in office. The New York Times RFK Jr. RAWSEP view lack of knowledge of science and medicine idiotic debate is useful distraction for Trump and Maha. From the article headline is full-fat dairy healthier? The New York Times TV Netflix has a new house in the suburbs. Come in and chill. The New York Times TV comedian Jimmy Kimmel prepares for Hurricane Epstein. The New York Times Trump Epstein fallout. Trump approves the Epstein files release, but some may be withheld. The New York Times Trump jobs delayed jobs data to give snapshot of a labor market under stress. The New York Times Trump lack of jobs. Holiday hiring slows frustrating job seekers. The New York Times Canada trans rights denied on the province level. Alberta invokes last resort constitutional clause to shield trans laws from challenges. The New York Times Denmark salvage bail took 30 years to write on the calculation of volume. It is a sensation. The New York Times Spain Franco died 50 years ago, but he is still winning new fans in Spain. The New York Times Ukraine move over Netflix. The Ukraine corruption investigators bring the drama. The New York Times Ukraine US-Russian peace plan would force Ukraine to cede land and cut army. The New York Times Saudi Arabia opinion. The Trump embrace of the Saudi crown prince. The New York Times Japan. The hunt is on for bears in Japan after deadly attacks. The New York Times. The Philippines ex-mayor is sentenced to life for human trafficking tied to scam centers. The New York Times South Korea ferry crashed after operator was distracted by his phone. Officials say. The New York Times Saudi Arabia Trump meeting with Saudi prince showcased the makeover of the prince and the makeover of America. The New York Times headlines. The New York Times November 19, 2025. Artificial intelligence documentaries. AI video is threatening our ability to trust documentaries. The New York Times artificial intelligence NVIDIA earnings fuel rally in global technology stocks. The New York Times artificial intelligence NVIDIA earnings show profit jumped 65% to $31.9 billion. The New York Times artificial intelligence. The world craves AI chips. The New York Times artificial intelligence. Jan LeCun, a pioneering AI scientist, leaves Meta. The New York Times California, San Francisco self-driving taxis are catching on. Are you ready? The New York Times Comey Lindsay Halligan admits grand jury never saw final Comey indictment. The New York Times Congress House votes to kill bill allowing senators to sue government. The New York Times consumers recipes. Thanksgiving pies so good you will want to skip dinner. NYT. Cooking internet Cloudflare outage disrupts ChatGPT and other parts of the internet. The New York Times internet opinion. The Patreon CEO my vision for a better internet. The New York Times Iowa and Iowa City when buses were made free traffic cleared and so did the air. The New York Times Kansas helping to save the bees with plants in Kansas. The New York Times Mamdani Trump and Mamdani will meet at White House on Friday. The New York Times Maryland RAWSEP view House of Representatives run for Nadler seat. Democrat was in the past a Republican. From the article headline George Conway, a vocal foe of Trump eyes congressional run. The New York Times Mexico is now the top buyer from the United States. The New York Times movies. The most anticipated book adaptations of 2025 movies and TV shows. The New York Times Musk opinion. Elon Musk cannot possibly deserve his $1 trillion payday. The New York Times nature video reveals how far wolves will go to steal a meal. The New York Times nature tracking. We can now track individual monarch butterflies. It is a revelation. The New York Times Nebraska in Nebraska makeovers for buildings that do not price out the locals. The New York Times Republicans opinion on Republican neo-Nazism, Hamas, and Israel, an epidemic of moral cowardice. The New York Times Republicans opinion. The 3 Republican women who defied Trump on Epstein. The New York Times rural voters opinion. Rural kids need more than vocational school. The New York Times Science and Medicine new gene editing strategy could help development of treatments for rare diseases. The New York Times Science and Medicine human interest opinion. Anorexia was my revolt against Mother Nature. The New York Times South Carolina. They love their family land in South Carolina, but who actually owned it? The New York Times Texas lack of art. Lubbock will remove Buddy Holly themed crosswalk after federal crackdown. The New York Times Texas lack of knowledge of medicine and science. Measles strain continues to spread. The New York Times Trump citizenship test opinion. Trump made the citizenship test harder. What if every American had to take it? The New York Times Trump Epstein fallout opinion. The Jeffrey Epstein victims are the real story. The New York Times Trump Epstein fallout. Trump signs bill calling for release of Epstein files within 30 days. Live updates. The New York Times Trump and Fed December rate cut in doubt as Fed fault lines deepen. Minutes show. The New York Times Trump FEMA. Trump wanted to abolish FEMA. His own advisors disagree. The New York Times Trump Department of Justice 60 attorneys on the year of chaos inside the Trump Justice Department. The New York Times Trump lack of jobs and lack of data after shutdown. Labor Department says some data is gone for good. The New York Times Trump schools. Trump administration announces steps to dismantle Education Department. The New York Times Trump and species. RAWSEP view Governor Newsom called Trump an invasive species as an insult at COP30, and Trump days later moves to weaken the Endangered Species Act. Coincidence? I think not. Every word he hears is parsed by Trump, but incorrectly. From the article headline Trump moves to weaken the Endangered Species Act, the New York Times Trump tariffs sent trade plummeting. In August, the New York Times University's opinion, we lost our mission. 3 university leaders on the future of higher ed. The New York Times Washington and Washington birds are giving Yelp reviews of forest restoration work. The New York Times Ukraine U.S. Russian peace plan would force Ukraine to cede land and cut army. The New York Times Turkey German family, who died while visiting Istanbul, may have been poisoned. Authorities say. The New York Times Saudi Arabia Musk here is who is attending the Trump dinner for the Saudi Crown Prince Elon Musk, Cristiano Ronaldo, and more. The New York Times Saudi Arabia things happen. Trump brushes off the murder of Khashoggi. The New York Times Saudi Arabia opinion. No Trump, we cannot leave it at that. The New York Times Saudi Arabia opinion. The White House gold rush is on. The New York Times Saudi Arabia once shunned has corporate titans swooning for deals. The New York Times Saudi Arabia, the prince has big plans, but his giant fund is low on cash. The New York Times Saudi Arabia, Trump berates Mary Brusoff. ABC News after question about Jamal Khashoggi. The New York Times Saudi Arabia, Trump lauds MBS during White House visit and dismisses the Khashoggi killing. The New York Times Saudi Arabia, why does Trump, the America First president, keep looking to foreign leaders? The New York Times China in the AI race, Chinese talent still drives American research. The New York Times China opinion, the Trump trade war showed that China can stand up to America. The New York Times Japan, the most impactful political handbag since Thatcher. The New York Times headlines. The Guardian November 20th, 2025 California, San Francisco, the FDA has warned against this natural remedy for joint pain. San Francisco immigrants still trust it's San Francisco. The Guardian consumers phones. The landline may be having a renaissance, but it is to a world in which the art of phone calls has changed. Paul Daly. The Guardian Georgia U.S. House of Representatives, will Marjorie Taylor Greene turn the mega movement against Trump? Arwa Mahdawi. The Guardian Internet. Larry Ellison discussed axing CNN host with White House in takeover bid talks. Trump administration. The Guardian Mamdani. New York City mayor in 2026. Trump and Mamdani to meet in Oval Office on Friday after months of bickering. Zoran Mamdani. The Guardian movies Smile, You Smile, a new generation of stars is overthrowing the old Hollywood system one no at a time. Priya. Elon. The Guardian pollution. Thousands of toxic sites across U.S. face risk of coastal flooding. The Guardian TV champagne problems review. The Netflix latest Christmas rom-com lacks fizz romance films. The Guardian TV comedian Jimmy Kimmel on Epstein files congressional vote. Make no mistake, this is not over. Late night TV roundup. The Guardian Trump crypto fallout. The Guardian view on the crypto latest crash. It reveals who pays the price for a failing economy. Editorial. The Guardian Trump Epstein fallout. Every time new emails drop, elites do the Epstein shuffle. Yes, I knew him, but I did not know him. Emma Brox. The Guardian Trump Department of Justice DOJ has 30 days to release all Epstein files after Trump signs bill. U.S. politics live. Trump tariffs. The Trump affordability efforts are a mess of absurdity and magical thinking. Stephen Greenhouse. The Guardian Canada nature raiders of the lobster pot. Canadian wolves learn to loot crab traps for bait animals. The Guardian. Brazil under Lula jailhouse shock. Brazil coup monger Bolsonaro finally faces life behind bars. Jair Bolsonaro. The Guardian Australia. Will the government cuts to the CSIRO produce the right results? Fiona Kataska's The Guardian RAWSEP view from Wikipedia. The CSIRO, or Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, is an Australian government agency responsible for scientific research and its commercial applications. It aims to solve significant challenges through innovative science and technology, collaborating with leading organizations globally established under the Science and Industry Research Act. 1949. CSIRO plays a crucial role as the Australia National Science Agency. United Kingdom. How can Labour see off reform? Both Andy Burnham and Shabana Mahmood offer clues. Julian Coman. The Guardian. United Kingdom people are right to ask, what is the point of Labour when it cannot agree on anything? Martin Kettle. The Guardian. United Kingdom. The Starmer squandering of a historic election victory is a tragedy nearing its finale. Raphael Baer. The Guardian. United Kingdom. The days of 4% pay rises are behind us. Wages are now barely growing faster than inflation. Greg Jericho. The Guardian. United Kingdom. What does the left want? A wealth tax. What will that accomplish? Very little. Adifir Chakraborty. The Guardian. Spain suffering betrayal, impending doom. The alienated youth of Spain in pictures photography. The Guardian. France. French conservatives are inching towards a pact with Le Pen that could enable a far-right takeover of the country. Paul Taylor. The Guardian. Ukraine. War briefing. Rescuers comb through rubble after Russian attack kills at least 26 Ukraine. The Guardian. Ukraine. Zelensky to meet U.S. Army Secretary after American and Russian officials draft plan to end war. Europe Live. The Philippines. Alice Guo, Chinese national who ran huge scam center while Philippines mayor sentenced to life in prison. Philippines. The Guardian. The Philippines. Cognac tortoises and a pink striped helicopter inside the mystery of Alice Guo, the missing Philippines mayor. Philippines. The Guardian. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Prince Mohammed is being lavished with praise by Trump. It is clear why. Mohammed Bazi. The Guardian. Saudi Arabia. The Saudification of America is underway. Karen Ataya. The Guardian. Uganda. Mahmoud Mamdani on Zoran Uganda and forced expulsion, who is part of the nation and who is not. Zoran Mamdani. The Guardian headlines. The Guardian. November 19, 2025 air pollution standards. The World Health Organization WHO to lose nearly a quarter of its workforce, 2,000 jobs, due to U.S. withdrawing funding. World Health Organization. The Guardian. Artificial intelligence. We excel at every phase of AI. NVIDIA CEO quells Wall Street fears of AI bubble amid market sell-off. NVIDIA. The Guardian. California Democrat billionaire environmental activist Tom Steyer announces run for California governor. California. The Guardian. Comey full grand jury did not see final Comey indictment. Prosecutors admit James Comey. The Guardian. Human interest. I look at a stranger and see a friend. Am I a super recognizer? Well, actually, the Guardian. RAWSEP views super recognizer is a term coined in 2009 by Harvard and University College London researchers for people with significantly better than average face recognition ability. Super recognizers are able to memorize and recall thousands of faces, often having seen them only once. Internet. When fonts fight times New Roman conquers. Publishing. The Guardian. Mamdani. Trump signals he may soon meet with political adversary Zoran Mamdani. Zoran Mamdani. The Guardian. Music pictures unite. How pop music fell in love with socialist infographics designed. The Guardian. Texas ruling against redistricting. Nobel Prize for fiction judge excoriates colleague in Texas redistricting case. Texas. The Guardian. TV comedian Jimmy Kimmel on Epstein files congressional vote. Make no mistake, this is not over. Late night TV roundup. The Guardian. Texas judge rejects racially gerrymandered maps in Texas that gave Republicans extra districts. Texas. The Guardian. Trump versus the climate. The Trump agenda against climate could result in 1.3 million more deaths globally. Analysis finds climate crisis. The Guardian. Trump economy failure. The Trump focus on race backfires as voters punish economic failings. U.S. economy. The Guardian. Trump Epstein fallout. Every time new emails drop, elites do the Epstein shuffle. Yes, I knew him, but I did not know him. Emma Brock's The Guardian. Trump Epstein fallout. Is the Trump remarkable run of fealty coming to an end? The Guardian. Trump Epstein fallout. Trump signs bill to compel release of more Epstein documents. The Guardian. Trump pardons. A classic authoritarian tactic. Outrage over the Trump pardons for friends and allies. The Guardian. Trump pardons January 6th rider who was pardoned by Trump arrested for child sexual abuse. U.S. Capitol attack. The Guardian. Trump tariffs. The Trump plan to impose semiconductor tariffs may be delayed. Sources say Trump tariffs. The Guardian. Universities research. State Department to cut 38 universities from research program over DI policies. U.S. universities. The Guardian. Australia. Papua New Guinea not happy as Australia walks away from bid to host COP31. The Guardian. United Kingdom. Nigel Farage far-right Reform Party. He used to say things like Hitler was right. Farage faces more allegations of racist behavior at school. Nigel Farage. The Guardian. Ukraine. U.S. and Russian officials draft plan to end Ukraine war based on capitulation from Kiev. Ukraine. The Guardian. Turkey will host COP31 in 2026. From Australia to Turkey and reluctantly Germany. The tug of war over hosting COP31. COP30. The Guardian. Turkey to host COP31 climate conference after Australia drops push to hold it in Adelaide. COP31. The Guardian. Saudi Arabia. Unforgivable. The Trump piggy insult is stoking more outrage than usual. The Guardian. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Prince Mohammed is being lavished with praise by Trump. It is clear why. Mohammed Bazi. The Guardian. Saudi Arabia. Trump shrugged off the Khashoggi killing. This is a new low. Jody Ginsburg. The Guardian. Saudi Arabia. Trump and his ilk imagine a world without international law, but they will not achieve it. Philippe Sands. The Guardian. China does not want to lead alone on climate policies. Senior advisor warns. COP30. The Guardian. Headlines. Other media. November 20th, 2025. California Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom just roasted Trump with quiet piggy me, and the internet loses it. Mamdani. New York City mayor in 2026. Trump invites Mamdani to White House while slamming him as a communist. North science drones gather critical health info above the blowhole of a right whale. RFK Jr. lack of knowledge of medicine and science. CDC fills its autism webpage with talking points against vaccination. Trump Epstein fallout. White House promises to make a scene after Epstein defeat Trump. Jobs. The Jobs report is here with data that is 2 months late. Canada student mauled to death by wolves in brutal attack after ignoring call for help. Saudi Arabia. Caroline Leavitt skips big White House event after posting cryptic quote about being weak.
Red Green Fox here. The quick red green fox jumped over the barriers to clean air. Red Green Fox here. Ready to sing to you the names of the 2025 major wood-burning biomass industry subsidy opponents. 1. Biofuel Watch. 2. Bulkley Valley Stewardship Coalition of British Columbia, Canada. 3. Comite Schoen Luft, which means Beautiful Air Committee in German. 4. Dogwood Alliance. 5. Equity Group Foundation, nicknamed EGF. 6. Environmental Paper Network, nicknamed EPN. 7. Natural Resources Defense Council, nicknamed NRDC. 8. Prakaunia Narzek Wissenskik Istet, which means Workshop for All Beings in Polish. 9. Rachel Carson Council. 10. Solutions for Our Climate, nicknamed SFOC.
Cat's corner strategy with Tiger and Leone. Saying the quiet part out loud. Roar. Hi, I am Tiger. Our human asked us to get up from our naps and start Cat's Corner strategy with Tiger and Leone. She gave us a list of internet allies which we will post for her here.
Hi, I am Leone. It is better for your mental fitness to go to these websites than to go to bro sites for advice. Substack letters from an American Heather Cox Richardson. Substack your local epidemiologist. The Midas Touch. The Guardian. The New York Times.
One introduction. RAWSEP view. The United States government was on track in the Biden administration to reduce the prices for both clean energy heat pumps and clean energy electric cars. Trump tariffs are expected to upset those plans to prevent future air pollution and prevent climate change. The United States government should, instead of certifying wood stoves as safe when they are not safe, go forward with regulations that ban wood stove use and direct government money for use of forest refuse only for home building and furniture building. For just a few examples of use of forest products for non-burning uses, it is well known from scientific and medical research that wood burning is a substantial source of PM 2.5 emissions. Yet the wood burning industry uses the scientifically debunked theory named carbon neutrality of wood burning to argue that wood burning replacing coal burning in industry, and in a trickle-down argument that wood burning should continue for home heating should continue. Presumably because it is called renewable, wood may be renewable in the sense that a tree can be planted in the place of a cut-down burned tree. But it takes centuries or decades for the newly planted tree to attain the stature of the cut-down burned tree. During those centuries or decades, photosynthesis, which converts CO2 to oxygen, and so sequesters some carbon, will not take place at the same rate as photosynthesis was performed previously, and wood burning emits both CO2 and PM 2.5, and PM 2.5 is Not absorbed by trees, so PM2.5 is not diminished by planting a tree in the place of a cut down and burn tree. In fact, a living tree closes its pores against the presence of PM2.5 from nearby wood burning, just as humans hold their breath in the presence of PM2.5 from nearby wood burning. And when a tree closes its pores, the level of photosynthesis that absorbs CO2 pollution goes down. Wood burning emits 90% PM2.5 particulate matter of 2.5 micrometer size, the perfect size to infiltrate the human lungs, setting off a cascade of human health problems and early deaths. Contrary to many beliefs, wood burning emits 2.8 times the PM2.5 as the fossil fuel coal burning, and wood burning emits 450 times the PM2.5 as the fossil fuel natural gas burning. Replacing coal burning with wood burning creates more air pollution in the form of CO2 and PM2.5 than coal burning. This emission data comes from testing the cleanest burning wood stove in the United Kingdom. The Eco-Design Wood Stove and International Convention does not count the emissions from wood burning. The emissions from wood burning are erased from all countries around the world when calculating if each country has met its climate goals. This non-counting or erasure of wood burning emissions data from climate goals does not mean wood burning emissions do not exist. RAWSEP View Purple Air PM2.5 monitors hanging from the eaves of the house of a near neighbor should be used to measure the level of PM2.5 in the air hyperlocally in the yards of near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners. If PM2.5 levels exceed World Health Organization standards of 5 micrograms per cubic meter annually, then that evidence of air pollution from wood burning should lead to the shutdown of that indoor residential wood burning appliance, one appliance at a time if necessary.